So you're thinking about a career as a natural resources consultant. Good call. Sending over all these materials, especially that RoleCatcher career guide. Looks like you're interested in more than just, the typical job hunting advice.
Yeah.
You want to understand what this job, really is.
Yeah.
And that's smart because there's way more to it than just, loving nature.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Which I'm sure you already know.
Of course. Of course.
The guide spends a lot of time on, responsible use of resources.
Yeah.
So it's not just about saying no to development.
Right.
It's about finding that balance.
It's about finding that balance. A natural resource consultant really sits at the intersection of industry, policy, and environmental science. So they have to consider economic development, environmental protection, and the needs of, all the different stakeholders involved.
Like a real balancing act.
Exactly, a real balancing act.
Speaking of balancing, let's talk about those pros and cons the guide lays out.
Okay, yeah.
Job security looks pretty promising. They mentioned an 8% growth projection over the next 10 years.
Yeah, that's a good sign.
But then they bring up these challenging physical conditions, and it made me realize this isn't just about, hiking through the woods, is it?
Well, it can be.
Okay.
But it's not always. It depends, what kind of, what your specialization is. Think about assessing the environmental impact of, a wind farm versus something like a mining operation.
Huge difference.
Yeah, one might have you hiking through a forest, right?
Right.
The other could place you on a dusty industrial site, dealing with, heavy machinery and all the environmental concerns that come with that.
Yeah, and those environmental concerns are totally different, too.
Completely different.
You've got noise pollution from the machinery, bird migration patterns for the wind farm.
Soil erosion, water contamination.
Yeah. Okay, now that you mention it, the guide lists a pretty surprising range of skills. I mean, biology and geography, that makes sense to me.
Sure.
But law and government, why do you need those?
Well, imagine you're a consultant.
Right.
And you're trying to convince, say, a mining company to adopt more sustainable practices.
Okay.
You need to understand not just the environmental impact of what they're doing, but also the legal framework that they operate in. You might even have to, communicate the benefits of those practices to local communities.
That's a good point.
Who might be, a little wary of any sort of industrial activity near them.
Right, of course, yeah.
So you have to be able to speak their language, too.
So it's about knowing the science, but also, connecting with people.
Absolutely.
Building trust, maybe even, negotiating some compromises.
100%. You're essentially translating all this complex scientific data into language that everyone understands, from CEOs to, like you said, local communities.
Let's they're the bridge, right?
Yeah, exactly. You're the bridge, and you're advocating for solutions that work for everybody involved. That's why, the guide actually ranks things like customer service and communication skills. It's way more important than, say, physics.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, that is wild. It's making me rethink what a natural resources consultant actually does on a daily basis.
Right.
We've got to dig more into that.
Yeah.
All right, so we've established this isn't just about, hugging trees all day.
Definitely not.
It's about navigating this whole complex world of science and policy and people skills.
Absolutely. And that complexity, I think, only grows as you climb the career ladder.
Which, speaking of the guide details, the typical entry-level work, and a lot of it is research analysis reports. It kind of sounds like a pretty standard office job at first glance.
Yeah, it can be. Especially, early on, you might be stuck behind a computer, doing data entry, literature reviews, that sort of thing.
Right.
But even then, there's a good chance you'll be out in the field, too. Oh, yeah. Collecting samples, conducting surveys, maybe even attending community meetings.
Interesting.
To, gather input on a project.
Okay, so you're saying it's not all spreadsheets and lab coats.
Not at all.
There's actual field work involved, which I bet is a big draw for our listener.
Definitely. But the real excitement, at least for me, is seeing how consultants at that senior level, they become these strategic advisors.
Yeah.
With a much wider sphere of influence.
The guide mentioned they can have national, even international impact. What did that look like in the real world?
Well, I once worked with a consultant who was advising this major energy company on the environmental and social impacts of building a new pipeline.
Wow.
And this pipeline was going across multiple countries.
Okay, yeah, that's a big project.
It was fascinating to see how they had to navigate not just the ecological concerns, right, but also the cultural and political sensitivities of all these different communities.
Oh, of course.
All along the proposed route.
Wow. That's incredible. Talk about high-stakes problem solving.
Yeah.
This consultant wasn't just, like, mitigating environmental damage. They were, like, shaping the entire project.
Exactly. They were actually able to convince the company to reroute a section of the pipeline to avoid this one sensitive ecological area
Wow.
and to implement all these community development programs along the route.
Oh, that's fantastic.
So those were significant wins.
Yeah.
That wouldn't have been possible without, their expertise and their negotiation skills.
That's what I'm talking about, from analyzing soil samples
Yeah.
to, like, influencing these huge international projects.
Right.
The scope of this career is seriously impressive.
It really is. And it highlights how those core skills we talked about, the scientific knowledge, the communication, the negotiation, those become even more critical as you move up that ladder.
And speaking of moving up, our listeners thinking about the whole job hunting process too. They sent over some materials about interview prep and resume building, which, RoleCatcher also offers, by the way. We do our homework here.
Always a good sign.
It's like the stakes just get higher and higher, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you get more experience. But that also means more opportunity to make a real difference.
Oh, absolutely. And that brings us to, the interview process itself.
Okay.
One of the questions in the guide really stood out to me. It was, how do you balance the needs of clients with the need to protect natural resources and the environment?
Ooh, that's a tough one.
It's a really tough one.
Because it gets right to the heart of this whole career.
Yeah,
right?
right.
It's that tightrope walk we were talking
Yeah.
about. You can't just be like an activist for the environment, right?
Right.
You have to find solutions that work in the real world where, companies need to function.
You got it. I think a good answer, at least, would focus on communication and, finding that common ground.
Okay.
You have to be able to really clearly articulate the environmental risks.
Right.
But also be willing to listen to the client's needs and try to find ways to, mitigate those risks without completely derailing their whole project.
So you're like a problem solver and negotiator.
Yeah.
A translator between the world of science and the world of, business and development.
Precisely. And that takes a deep understanding of, environmental regulations.
Right, of course.
And best practices. You need to know what's required by law, what's considered best practice in the industry, and then, use all that knowledge to come up with these innovative solutions that satisfy both the client and, are good for the environment.
This has been so insightful. We've gone from the nitty-gritty of, soil samples to the high-level world of international policy and these huge projects.
Yeah.
And it's clear that natural resources consultants, they play this, vital role in shaping a more sustainable future.
100%. It's a career path with challenges, for sure, but also with incredible rewards.
Knowing you're making a real difference.
Exactly.
And for our listener out there, I hope this deep dive has given you a much clearer picture of what this career really is, both the day-to-day realities and that potential to make a real impact. And remember, the materials we discussed, they focus a lot on what you need to succeed in this field. But as you move forward, it's worth thinking about the bigger picture too. We hear a lot about sustainable development, but how do we actually measure the impact of these efforts on something as complex as, the entire environment? That's something to ponder as you continue exploring this path. Until next time, keep asking those insightful questions.